We started a series last week called The Shocking Words of Jesus. And we're doing it because we're considering his teachings. Today we're going to look at a very popular teaching of Jesus that a lot of people think, I understand what he's saying there. I'm not sure many people do. I think what he was getting at is quite interesting, but hard. So when I say the shocking words of Jesus, the difficult words of Jesus, I hear people say, oh, I love Jesus' teaching. I just don't like the church. I hear that and I think, you don't know his teachings. It's difficult to follow what he asks us to do. It's very hard. And so we're going to look at one of those today. We're going to find our way into a section of Scripture. But to get there, I want to start here. So for years now, Waypoint has been going on mission trips into the West Virginia, Kentucky area. These are little small towns where there was coal mining that existed. When the coal stuff shut down, people stayed, but there was nothing there economically. Very depressed, very difficult. I love going to these communities. I think it's great to see a different culture. I think it's great to get away, to let God have a shot at you away from your normal activities. And I think it's really helpful just to serve and love other people. So we've been doing this for a long time. And we've been going into these communities. And 2 years ago, we started noticing something weird. There were starting to be tourists who were coming to these little communities and spending money, which would raise the question, why? There's nothing here. There were no hotels. There's nothing there. There was one thing. We found it was one thing. There were ATV trails. Yeah, the good old boys were on their four-wheelers. There are miles and miles and miles of these trails. You can ride for days. The trails in that area are called the Hatfield and McCoy's Trail. Yeah. Now, some of you laugh for just a second because you recognize the name Hatfield and McCoy. Some of you, I found out this morning, some of you think that if that's just a wives' tale, it didn't really happen. It's actually a real thing. I'm going to give you just a little history, and I'm going to use my incredible art skills to help you follow this story along. Okay, so let's start with the Hatfields and the McCoys. All right? These two families did not get along with each other. Bad blood, you could say, between each other. Nothing horrible until one day when these three McCoys decided to stab this Hatfield 27 times and shoot him once. Okay? They fled, they were captured, and they were being held for a trial when this Hatfield died. And the rest of the McCoys, or the rest of the Hatfields, before the trial happened, took out the other three McCoys and executed them on the spot. And what happened is the McCoy family said, 3 for 1, that's a bad deal. We're going to start killing some more Hatfields to make this even. And they did. And then the Hatfields were like, no, that was even. And they started killing McCoys. Nobody knows how many. Like, the history of this is so dodgy, they can't figure it out. But anywhere from 12 to 20 people died in this family feud that went on. Now, what was surprising to me was that it was not the worst feud in U.S. history. There were two others that had over 30 people die, and then the granddaddy, there was one where 50 people died in revenge killings back and forth. It was in Texas. Everything's bigger in Texas. You should expect it, right? So 50 people died in that. Now, this concept of not letting something go, of finding a way to maybe pay back or get even or equal, has been around for a really long time. We're going to find it in the scriptures here. Not only are we going to find it in the scriptures, we're going to find that it's greatly misunderstood in the text. Just like I think it's misunderstood by many of us today. So I want to take you to some teaching of Jesus in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus goes out into the wilderness and he has his disciples. And many times you think that's the 12. No, this could be as many as 100 people. These are people who have decided, I'm a follower of his. So he's not talking to big crowds. This is people who are trying to find a way to be more like him. And he's helping them with teachings. If you want to read difficult, hard teachings of Jesus, go read the whole Sermon on the Mount. Understand what he's saying in there. It's difficult. Everything about what he says. But in Matthew chapter 5:38, he says this to his disciples who are listening. You have heard it said, eye for an eye and tooth for tooth. They would have heard it said. They would have heard it said actually in a couple ways. The one way that most everybody knows is that this was an instruction given by God in Leviticus. We can put Leviticus up. You can read it. I'm not going to take the time to read it. But there were instructions there that God gave that said, this is how I want the court system to work. I want you to give out just punishment for a just crime. You like, if somebody lost an eye, you can't kill somebody for that. And at this time in history, things were really kind of barbarian and unequal, uneven. If you had wealth and influence and you lost an eye, you could demand that the other person die for that offense, and people would do it. If you were wealthy and influential and you caused somebody to lose an eye and they asked for restitution, you could say, I'm not going to pay, and nobody would do anything about it. It was crazy. And so when God stepped into the system, he looked at Israel and said, I want there to be a just standard. Here it is. By the way, it wasn't if you lose an eye, you get to take their eye out. It was always a financial settlement, but it was so that there would be it would be the right amount. You can't bankrupt them, but you can take enough that it would equal like losing an eye. That's the kind of stuff that was going on. At the time, this is revolutionary. If you're like, man, this whole thing sounds barbaric. Yeah, it's a tough culture. But God stepped into that culture and he was starting to redeem that, and he gave them a principle that didn't count on your status. This was just the way things would be settled. And so this was a huge advancement, which, by the way, we would probably like that these days. Like, we would still say, we think the crime and the punishment should be equal. You can't, don't do too much. Don't go overboard. It's not right. It now becomes unjust. And so this principle interjected here makes a ton of sense. But I want you to keep in mind, this is really important. This was for the courts and the judges. This was a third party who would decide what was fair and just. They were given the boundary, but it was in the courts. But when Jesus said, you've heard it said, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, he wasn't talking about this. He wasn't talking about the court system. Because something else was going on in Jesus' day that was unique to their culture. There was a group of religious leaders, we know the Sadducees did this for sure, but there may have been others involved too, who started teaching that the eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth teaching was meant to be used for personal relationships. If somebody offended you personally, you knew what to do. If your neighbor harmed you, if there was a business transaction that went wrong, you could act because you knew what the boundary was. The boundary was if they did something to you, you could do something to them. And they were actually teaching that if you want to be an honorable follower of God, you'll pay somebody back in equal amounts. That's what was going on. And so when Jesus said, you've heard it said, he was tying into this thing that was being taught. Now, can I tell you, when I was growing up, I did not know the Sadducees taught this. I didn't know anybody taught this. This concept just simply sounded logical to me. If you mess with me, I believe that you were inviting me to mess with you. That's what I thought was happening. So if my brother would squirt me with a squirt gun, it was on. The problem I had, or at least I discovered as I went on with this, is I had difficulty not escalating the situation, right? So it would start with a squirt gun, It would not take long before I was chasing my brother with a bucket of water or with a hose, right? And I was gonna end it that way. And so I would, like we would have these arguments where we would fight with each other. By the way, this kind of thinking caused a lot of problems in my life. Because we'd be fighting and wrestling, and if he hit me in the face, I'm coming for him. Like, I'm gonna leave a mark. I left 2 marks, right? Because I wanted him to realize you can't mess with me. The problem was when you think that way is I got married when I'm young. And my wife did something to hurt me, emotionally, offensive, thing to say. I would think, oh, you're messing with me? Maybe it's time for me to teach you a thing or two, and I would come back and I would escalate. I don't know if you guys know this or not. That does not go well in a relationship. I had to discover this because it's just the way I processed. I mean, imagine, nobody ever sat down and taught me to do that. I just thought that was logical. And I imagine that many in this culture of Jesus' day thought it was logical too, but then on top of it, to have somebody from the culture come along and say, this is a God-honoring right thing to do. Pay them back. Crazy, right? Can't even imagine it. Well, I kind of think our culture has been training us in these ways for a long time. I wrote down some phrases I've heard. I'm curious to know if maybe you've heard these or you've said these at some point. Have you ever said, they started it? Which means everything I'm going to explain after this is justified. Right? Everything I've done after this, however bad it is, it's okay because they started it. Have you ever heard anybody say, I hope they receive some karma for that? Right? I mean, deep down, you're hoping something comes back and really messes with that person. I mean, if it could be you, awesome. But if it's not, at least somebody would put that person in their place. That would be fantastic. It's just karma. Payback is I'm not going to say that. It's all over our culture. And you wouldn't say it either unless you're mad. And some of you in your moment of anger, not only say that, you live that way. Like somebody is going to pay. Our culture is an eye for an eye culture. We've been trained since we were little kids to think this way. By the way, I'm not sure it goes far enough. I'm not sure it gets to the intent of what we really want, because we have a saying in our culture that I bet most of you could finish this. Try. I don't want to get even. I want to, what is it? Get ahead. How many of you have heard somebody in our culture say something like that? How many of you have said or thought something like that? I live this way. I'm not judging. This is kind of how we're raised at times. So were the people of Jesus' day, who were being told by religious leaders that the right and godly thing to do was to pay a person back if they did something to you in your personal relationships. They harmed you, go get them. So then Jesus says this, because he says, you've heard it said, they did. They've heard it said their whole lives. But verse 39, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Okay, that's crazy talk, right? It's crazy talk. That you would, and by the way, did you see the word he used in there? to really emphasize this. He said evil. Most of the time, when somebody does something offensive to you, you think, wow, they're not very sensitive. They're really callous or mean, or like you think there's something maybe wrong with their character a little bit, but you've never thought that person is evil. And I'm suggesting that if Jesus says you should have this response towards somebody who has evil intent, maybe our response to people who have less of an intent should be the same. The problem is with this little verse, there is so much cultural context going on that if you don't understand what's happening in the culture with this, you won't understand what Jesus is actually saying. So to help us with this, I've invited a volunteer to come forward. Yeah, he's going to come forward right now. So would you give him a hand and help him feel relaxed, because he wanted to know what exactly he was supposed to do, and I didn't want to tell him. I told him he didn't have to talk. That's true. What I didn't tell him was I was going to slap him in the face. So he'll be okay. It'll be fine. All right? Yeah, okay. Come on into the light. This is going to be a lot of fun. I mean, mostly for me, not for you. But so what I need you to face me, and I need you to show me your right cheek. Now, yeah, looks good. Okay. I need you to understand this. In Jesus' day, a slap to the face was not assault. It's not how they viewed it. It's a bummer for me. Like, I'm thinking, well, it's an insult. It was meant to be an insult. And I'm thinking, if you want to insult me, use your mean and ugly words, but keep your hands off the merchandise, right? Not for them. Not for them. This was not an abusive thing. This was a shot at humiliating you. This was a shot at undermining your honor. This was intended to be an insult, okay? And we know this because there are actual laws on the books about this whole process. There were penalties in place if you did this improperly that you could be charged for. Now, if you turn to me your right cheek, how do you slap a right cheek? Like, you're going to glance right off that baby, right? That's not good. So how do you slap a right cheek? Backhand. You don't smile after that. What is that? Okay? Backhanded. In the law of that day, a backhanded slap to the face was considered the worst possible insult and offense that you could level against another person. If you were found guilty of doing this improperly, like you were dishonoring this person and you had no grounds for that, you could face a double fine for that sort of activity. It was horrible. Okay? Interesting that Jesus starts with the worst possible thing that you could do to another person in a relationship. You insulted me to the max. You harmed my honor to the most anybody could do. You just did that. And Jesus says in that instance, turn the other cheek. Turn the other cheek. Turn the other cheek, right? Oh yeah, that looks good too. All right? Now, in the left cheek, that's clearly an open-handed shot, right? That you don't have to do anything backhand. You just, oh, good, you didn't smile that time. That was really great. Hey, give him a hand for being so slap happy. Thank you, man. Now, here's what was interesting. That slap, the open-handed slap to the left cheek, was considered a lesser insult. If there was a fine, that was the base fine. The double the fine is the backhand, and it would be doubled off of that open-handed slap. Now here, there's a lot of things going on that I want to help you understand, okay? I read some of David Bliven's work on this. I looked at the Bible Project. I read a lot of commentaries. I'm trying to get this as accurate as possible because there is so much confusion around this section of Scripture, and I'm trying to give it to you as clear as I can, okay? So a lot of this material is not mine, but I'm hoping that it will be helpful in helping you get a grasp of what's going on here. There are two major teachings that have been in the church for a long time that say this is what this verse is about. This is what Jesus was trying to say. One is that they claim that you're supposed to take abuse from people who give it to you. You just keep turning the other cheek and taking more and more and more abuse. This was not about abuse. This was about an insult in a personal relationship. I don't know if you know this or not, but in Jewish law, in Jesus' day, if you were beating your wife, it was grounds for a divorce. They protected her from that. They would not allow that to go on. There is no way Jesus is promoting something that they've already established in their culture. He is talking about this thing that happens between neighbors and friends and relatives and stuff like that, where we have these personal interactions. This is not an invitation for abuse, and we're going to get to why that is in just a minute. The second thing that's the most popular is that this is about some form of pacifism. He says, don't resist evil, so you shouldn't resist any kind of evil in your life. You should just keep turning your cheek and taking it. But again, as soon as you put this outside of the bounds of what Jesus is talking about, he's talking about personal relationships, and you try to make it bigger than that, it breaks. There is not an ounce. There's not an ounce of that in Judaism. There is in Judaism, you should resist evil, which is why I think Jesus uses the word, resist evil. There was a belief that you should stand up and find a way to resist things that are wrong, cling to things that are good. And so he's not trying to upend that whole cart. What he's trying to address is that there was this belief that in your personal relationships, you no longer needed a court to decide what you could do. You could harm another person who harmed you. He was saying, I want you to think differently about this. Here's what all of this stuff signified. It's kind of interesting. When you got hit in the right cheek with the worst possible insult and you turned the left, you were rejecting the power of that insult to actually land on you. The shame that that insult was trying to inflict, you didn't accept. The undermining of your honor, you weren't having a part of it. You were actually resisting, but in a way that had never been described before. Because up until this point, if somebody insulted you like that, you could insult them back. You would be justified. You would be encouraged to do it. And Jesus said, no. I want you to reject that statement, but I want you to turn the other cheek. The turning the other cheek was also a statement about, you know what? If you do hit me again, it's going to be on my left cheek. I'm going to limit what you have the possibility of doing to me. You don't get a free-for-all. And here's the statement that it makes. If you didn't cripple me, hitting me with your worst possible insult, what chance is there that you're actually going to down me when you hit me with a lesser one? None. You have no power over me. You do not define me. I am not who you say I am. It was a power move. It was a power move that showed that you were resting who you are, who you believed you were, in a different place. Not on the outcome of what that person said, but somewhere else. By the way, I think this is exactly how insults work. You get hurt by something that somebody says, or maybe they do something. Actions speak louder than words, we think. We have some sort of interaction where they do something behind our back and then we find out. And what happens is that we start mulling over that insult that was laid in our lives. We stay up at night replaying what's happened. we think about that, what that means about who we are and how we are. We start to get a little angry about that. And it begins to shape how we think and how we respond. It determines what kind of emotions I'm going to walk around with. It determines the kind of thinking where I hope they get some payback. It starts, if it stays long enough, it can start to turn into bitterness. They own you. That insult landed, that shame that you carried has landed, and it's starting to shape you. And Jesus is suggesting, I can't have this stuff define you. Like if you're a follower of mine, what I need you to know and understand is that I think about you in a certain way. And it doesn't matter what insult has been lodged against you. I want you to find your rest and comfort in me. And if you do that, that means that you can respond in a kind way to somebody else because they don't shape you. I do. I'm the one who gets to do that. Band, would you make your way up here? You're going to help us in a little bit. This eye for an eye kind of thinking has been around so long. I don't know if it's just been logical for you. It's possible that your family lived this way, that you learned this watching somebody get back at somebody for doing something to you. And you just learned it, and it was taught, and you've kind of taken this into your life as a pattern. And then Jesus comes along and he says, listen, I'm not asking you to be a punching bag. I'm not asking you to be a pacifist. I'm asking you to think about the world in a different way. I want you to overcome evil by these kind acts where you release this stuff that has held your heart and it no longer shapes who you are. You're not wishing for karma. You're not hoping that you get to deliver it. You're free. You're released. God said, if you would just rely on me, if you would trust me, if you would follow me, all the shame, all the insult to your honor, all that kind of cold stuff, doesn't matter. Is it possible this morning that somebody in here is carrying around a mark that was left on them months ago, years ago, doesn't matter. It just came into your mind right now. The words that somebody said that have been haunting you for a long time. Is it possible that you've thought about letting it go, but you're really not sure how you can possibly do that? Like if you give that up, what are you supposed to do? Is it possible that deep down, you're hoping for some karma on somebody in your life? That they would receive some sort of payment for the harm that they did to you? Is it possible this morning for you to embrace this teaching of Jesus, who said, hey, what I do is I forgive, I support, I love. I give you a view of you that's higher than anybody else could give. And if you would rely on me, I can carry you past this burden. I think you can do it. I think it's possible for you not to live in the shadow of that thing. I think it's possible for you not to be burdened by the bitterness of this. I've learned over time that it is not an eye for an eye that makes you stronger. I still go back to it. Like it's a big part of our culture, but it's not shaping me as much as it was anymore. And I think it's possible for you to have that same kind of thing. But you're going to have to choose some teaching. It's difficult. You don't get to hang on to this. You give it up. And you fall into the arms of a God who loves you, who has an incredible view of who you are and what you're here for. Is it possible this morning that it's time for you to take that burden that you've been carrying and offer it up to Jesus? I hope you'll do that.